Well, we move to the next chapter this morning, Daniel chapter 5. And as we move to the next chapter, we've already said that the vessels have been taken out of the temple of Jerusalem and placed in the house of Nebuchadnezzar's god. Imagine those vessels in some kind of museum, a museum of treasures. And remember also we mentioned that the book of Daniel, certainly the first 6 chapters, we could describe it as the parable of the vessels. Now we're going to see that this morning because the vessels form a centerpiece of the final drama of the Babylonian Empire. So let's just read the first opening words here in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1. Belshazzar, we read there, the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords. Perhaps when you read those opening words there in Daniel chapter 5, you bring to mind the picture, the painting of Rembrandt, his famous painting of the Belshazzar feast in 1638. Just look at that picture, and you can certainly see, can't you, it captures the shock and the amazement of Belshazzar and those that were with him. And you can see the hovering hand and the words that have been etched into the plaster upon the wall. Now, Belshazzar, this chapter is about this king here, would have been a young boy. He was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the son of Nabonidus who married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And this man here would have lived as a small boy through the stirring opening chapters of Daniel, from chapters 1 to 4. So what would he have seen as he was growing up? Well, he would have seen, wouldn't he, how Daniel purposed within his heart and how he was 10 times brighter and more brilliant than the best of the astrologers and magicians. He would have seen a young Daniel go and interpret the vision of his grandfather. He would have seen 3 men who were prepared to go into the fiery furnace. Though there was that opposing golden image, yet they would never bow. And then he would have read that wonderful personal testimony of his own grandfather there, Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel chapter 4, that he would bow down to the Most High God. All these things, brothers and sisters, Belshazzar would have known about. He would have grown up within the court. Surely these things would have exercised an effect upon this man. But not only that, there's a few other things I'd like you to notice. Just turn over to Daniel chapter 7. We're not going to look at this chapter, but it's interesting, because when we look at Daniel chapter 7 and this vision of these 4 beasts that would come upon the world, come upon the nation of Israel, these successive powers, and they are described as beasts, as brute beasts, and the 4th one is unnamed. It is so terrible. It is not part of the animal kingdom. But notice there in verse 1, in the first year of Belshazzar, note. The chapter that we're reading tonight, or this morning, is the chapter of the closing of the empire of Babylon. So Daniel, in Daniel chapter 5, would have known about the 4 beasts. He would have known that the lion would be replaced by the bear. But also, if you turn over a chapter to Daniel chapter 8, you also see there that this took place in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. The vision of the ram and the he-goat, the 2-horned power of the Medo-Persians would face the onslaught of the powerful Greeks. So in other words, then, Daniel was well ahead of what was taking place during Belshazzar's reign. He would have been aware of the advent of Cyrus in the east. And certainly, Daniel's excitement levels would have been reaching fever pitch at this time. All these things were being fulfilled. Now, also, come back with me to Jeremiah chapter 25. Because here's the prophecy, some of you asked me about this, here's a prophecy here where Jeremiah spells out that the children of Israel would go into captivity for 70 years. And there's a few things I'd like you to notice about this chapter. Verse 1 then of Jeremiah 25, the word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So if you go down to verse 12, here's the all-important verse. And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make a perpetual desolation. So 70 years would transpire, and then the Jews would return back to the land. But then you look at verse 17. Then I took the cup at the Lord's hand, and made all the nations to drink, unto whom the Lord there. And that's interesting, isn't it? Hath sent me. Because here we see that the nation of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, is likened to a cup. And I want you to notice this. It's the cup in the Lord's hands. We're going to look at that a little later. And all the nations of the earth had drunk of her wine. All the nations had become intoxicated by Babylon. All the nations of the earth were bowing down to the golden image in Daniel chapter 3. And because all the nations were intoxicated, this would then bring an end to this empire. Can you see that, brothers and sisters? Very powerful allusions to Revelation, isn't it? Drunken of the blood of the saints in Revelation chapter 17. Babylon, the great, the mother harlots, and the abomination of the world, or the earth. So there's a lot of interesting connections there. So given that these prophecies were made, Belshazzar is going to take no notice. Come back to Daniel chapter 5. He's going to pour contempt on the prophecies that spoke of these vessels that were going to return. These vessels at this moment in time were in the treasure house, weren't they? But he's pouring contempt. He's disregarding it. He's putting it to one side. And he's now going to call out for these vessels to come out of the treasure house, and he's going to drink from them. In other words, he's saying, these vessels are going nowhere. They're staying here. I will be drinking from them. They will not be returning, just as these prophets of God had stated. Well, let's just read these opening verses then of Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine again before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God. Notice it's the golden vessels emphasized there. The golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives and his concubines, they drank in them. Now, I want you to notice, verse 2, that there was King Belshazzar, and he tasted of the wine. Now, I don't want you to imagine King Belshazzar as some kind of wine connoisseur here, sniffing the bouquet and delicately drinking the wine. That's not the idea of the word at all. The idea is that this man was totally inebriated. He's drunk out of his mind. And as he commands in this drunken state for these vessels to come, this is how he's going to disregard the vessels of Yahweh. And these vessels now are brought into the banquet. And the word tasted, brothers and sisters, as we've got on the screen, is the same word as the word decree. Now that's very interesting. It's not what you might be expecting. And this word is used throughout the book. Chapter 3, verse 10, verse 29, chapter 4, verse 6, and chapter 6, verse 26. So though, of course, he was drinking, what we're being told here was that he was loudly toasting and saluting his gods when he drank. It was a decree. It was his decree. He was overriding all these prophecies of the God of Israel. Now we notice that there were 1,000 lords drinking there in verse 1, and the wine was overflowing. The vessels were desecrated. And you can imagine his wives and his concubines there filling the room. And the king continues to lead the drinking and the toasting. And I want you to notice this, brothers and sisters, because I think this is very powerful. As he drinks and as he toasts and as he makes this decree, look to whom he makes the decree. So we notice there that in verse 4, they drank wine and they praised the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. So as you go through each material and each metal, it becomes inferior and inferior and inferior. Well, first of all, brothers and sisters, isn't there a similarity there to Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel chapter 2? This was a decree. We've already seen at the end of Daniel chapter 4 that Nebuchadnezzar now acknowledges that Nebuchadnezzar's image is right. His grandson doesn't. And he's pouring contempt upon Daniel chapter 2. We're back in Daniel chapter 3 in the golden image. Can you see that? The golden vessels are being brought in. This is the golden image being erected once again. This is Daniel 3 all over again, brothers and sisters. And not only are they getting inferior and inferior, these gods, and you can imagine them laughing, drunken, in a drunken state, as they go through these metals. What we're reading here is, as Belshazzar swears this decree of each of these gods, he's saying that even the God of stone, the most inferior of gods, is greater than Yahweh, the God of Israel. Can you see that? It's denying the power of the stone, isn't it? That's going to become a mountain and fill the whole earth. Can you see that, brothers and sisters? All these things in Daniel, it's a religious contest, as we've made that point several times. And it comes down to value, doesn't it? It comes down to value. It is this moment in time where a king of Babylon makes God's vessels worthless. Now, Nebuchadnezzar didn't make the vessels worthless, did he? Though he was the king of the earth, he placed those vessels in his treasure house. He viewed them as valuable. And so God was patient and long-suffering and working in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. And I do believe, because many of you have asked me, I do believe Nebuchadnezzar will be in the kingdom. Worked with this man. But with King Belshazzar, it was when he viewed these vessels as worthless, zero, God intervened. Can you see that, brothers and sisters? It's very powerful, isn't it? When they were worthless, it was God who intervened. Now, I want you to look at Jeremiah chapter 25 with me. Well, in the interest of time, come with me to Jeremiah 51. There's a whole string of references here that are interesting. Jeremiah spoke very passionately about what was going to take place in Daniel 5. But in the interest of time, let me just bring your attention to Jeremiah 51. We'll conclude here. So Jeremiah chapter 51 then, and look at these words here. Jeremiah says, "Thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up against Babylon and against them that dwell in the midst of them that rise up against me a destroying wind." Okay? So these are words of judgment that are being brought against the kingdom of Babylon. If you go down to verse 7, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand. Can you see these continual references of the cup? The vessels are being brought into the banquet room, yet the prophecy was that Babylon was the cup of God. It's a play on words, isn't it? That made all the earth drunken. We've seen that idea before. That the nations have drunken her wine, therefore the nations are mad, we read there. Verse 8, Babylon is suddenly fallen, is destroyed. Howl for her, take balm for her pain, if so she may be healed. If you go down to verse 28, we find that the nation who is going to overcome the Babylonians are identified. Verse 28, prepare against her the nations with the kings of the Medes, the captain thereof, and all the rulers thereof, and all the land of his dominion. That the nation of Israel, their hearts were being raised now. They'd heard of Cyrus in the east. Cyrus was on the march. He's approaching the walls of Babylon. Jeremiah chapter 51 here. And then go down to verse 58. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the broad walls of Babylon shall be utterly broken, and her high gate shall be burned with fire. Now that was a powerful, powerful message. I don't know if you've ever seen a bird's eye view of the city of Babylon. The entire perimeter of the walls, there were 3 parallel walls of 21 feet high. And across all the walls were soldiers. And if that wasn't sufficient, there was a 300 feet broad moat that surrounded the city. It was impregnable. It would stand forever. No wonder Daniel, when he said those words to Nebuchadnezzar, that Nebuchadnezzar at first just could not accept. Or perhaps it was over 20 years, we don't know. But that's why that golden image was established, because the walls were impregnable. It was designed to last forever. But here, Jeremiah the prophet says, these walls would be utterly broken down. And then the message is emphatic. Notice verse 64, and thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise from the evil that I will bring upon her. And what Jeremiah does, and I want you to imagine this in the court. It was a very powerful metaphoric message. There was Jeremiah, and he reads from the scroll that Babylon would never rise again, and he places a stone within this scroll, and he throws it into the river Euphrates, and the scroll goes down to the riverbed as a message, as a figure, as a metaphor, that Babylon would never rise again. But Nebuchadnezzar was just laughing these words to scorn. Well, it was the time of Belshazzar, and things now are dramatically going to change. Come back then to Daniel chapter 5. So I want you to imagine 1,000 lords, wives and concubines, with a king, and they packed the room. Have a look at verse 5 of Daniel chapter 5. In the same hour, you may have in your margin immediately, as soon as those vessels touched their lips, immediately there was a response from God. God intervened at the very moment. Immediately, in the same hour, came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So just imagine, amongst all the screaming and the professing of their gods, suddenly, out of nowhere, they see a hand writing upon the wall. It would have been electrifying, wouldn't it, brothers and sisters? To see a dismembered hand with no man, with no arm, with a small part of a hand, with fingers etching words across a plaster wall. Can you imagine that, brothers and sisters? And it was inscribing words upon a wall. It was almost like the wall became a gravestone. And this was the epitaph of what was about to take place to Babylon. And we read these words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now, I want you just to imagine that the words are written in Hebrew, as we know it's from right to left. And so then the hand would cover the writing as it was etched upon the wall. And then when the hand had completed the writing, the full statement was revealed. It wasn't in not being able to understand the Hebrew. Perhaps they didn't understand Hebrew, but I don't think that was the point. They could read it, but the fact was the words were hidden until it was finally revealed. And then when they read it, they could understand the words, but they couldn't decipher the message. And if you look down, you can see there that there was a candlestick. There was a candlestick there that was flickering away in front of the plaster wall. You notice there, it's in verse 5. So I want you to notice there's a candlestick that's flickering away, and the light is throwing up light upon the wall. And I wonder, brothers and sisters, whether that was the golden menorah. I wonder whether Belshazzar desecrated all the vessels of God and brought in the menorah. And how poignant that would be if that was the menorah, God's light, which was there in the midst of the tabernacle and the temple. And those lights never went out. And it was that light that was throwing up light upon the wall and revealing the message from the hand of God. Now, this wasn't new, was it? Remember when Joshua went into the land? What did he do? He took 2 great boulders, didn't he? And he plastered them. And he placed the law of Moses upon those stones. Can we just have a read about that? Deuteronomy chapter 9, because it's an interesting expression that's used here. Can you remember how Moses describes these 2 whitewashed, plastered rocks or stones? Well, he says that they were written by the finger of God. Let's have a look at that. Deuteronomy chapter 9. And as we read these verses, just connect with what we've just been looking at in Daniel 5. Deuteronomy 9 and verse 9, when I was gone up into the mount to receive the tables of stone, even the tables of the covenant, which the Lord made with you, then I abode in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. Verse 10, and the Lord delivered unto me 2 tables of stone, written by the finger of God. And on them was certain according to all the words which the Lord spake with you in the mount, out in the midst of the mount, in the fire in the day of the assembly. Now, so we've got the finger of God. The finger of God has written the law. But what was the law? How did the law start? Can you remember, brothers and sisters? Well, go back to Exodus chapter 20. What was the first bit of text that was there upon the stones? Well, we know this well, don't we? Here we read of the 10 Commandments, but just notice how it begins. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd, 4th generation. Can you see that? That's exactly what Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar and Belteshazzar had done. They had made other gods, they had made graven images, and they had bowed down. And there was Belshazzar, there. And the very words that were inscribed upon the wall, made by the finger of God, would have told this king that these words on the wall had been there for a long, long time, brothers and sisters. A long, long time. We'll come back to Daniel chapter 5. And we have very descriptive language in how Belshazzar responded to these words. Verse 6 then. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. So the language is very descriptive here. We see the king totally quaking in his boots. And I want you to notice the word joints. The word joints means knots. Knots. So it's quite an amusing picture. His limbs became unknotted. He became a picture of jelly flopping about. His limbs gave way. He's certainly not looking like a king at this moment in time, is he, brothers and sisters? So I want you to imagine that. Here was a man who was knotted, his limbs were all enjoined, and then he looks upon the writing of the wall and he's loosened. His joints become all loose. But it says there, the joints of his loins were loosed. So he relieved himself, brothers and sisters. There's no other way to say it. He looked upon the writing of the wall, and a great puddle of water formed around his feet. That's how frightened this king was. This great king of Babylon. Now, what do you think the finger of a man's hand here was impressing upon this king? Well, I believe, brothers and sisters, that this king should have known about Isaiah 45, because I believe that this was the scroll that Daniel himself had. Come back to Isaiah 45. And I want you to imagine how all these things were taking place in the court there, in the banquet room. And I believe Daniel had this scroll underneath his arm, he knew that this was going to happen. Look how these words were going to be fulfilled to the letter in Daniel chapter 5. So we'll pick up then in verse 27 of Isaiah 44. So we read there, that saith to the deep, be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. And we know that Cyrus, when he looked at those three parallel walls, he knew that he couldn't navigate those walls, so he diverted the river Euphrates and he went underneath the walls. Then we read verse 28, that saith of Cyrus. Now bear in mind that Cyrus was named 125 years in Isaiah before this man came about. He is my shepherd and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundations shall be laid. And then Isaiah 45. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus. So Cyrus was named 125 years before these events took place in Daniel 5, whose right hand I have holden. So Cyrus now is a figure of the right hand. And I wonder, brothers and sisters, I wonder whether the hand there in the court was the hand of Cyrus. And Cyrus was going to be at the walls that night. To subdue nations before him, I will loose the loins of kings. That's Daniel 5, verse 6. To open before the two-leaved gates. Now, historians tell us that the Babylonians felt so oppressed by Nebuchadnezzar that when the Babylonians first entered the city underneath the walls, they actually opened up the doors because Nebuchadnezzar, and certainly Belshazzar, was understood to be a very oppressive king, where Cyrus, historians tell us, hated slavery. And so they felt then their lives under Cyrus would be much better. So they opened up the doors. And the gate shall be shut. I will go before thee and make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of brass and cut in asunder the bars of iron. Why? For I am Yahweh, verse 5, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. Can you imagine? I think Daniel had this scroll. And when it all happened and Cyrus came in, he said, look, it was all done. Did you divert the river Euphrates? Oh, yes, I did. Did you find that some of the gates were open? Yes, we did find that. Can you see that hand? I can't miss it, Daniel. Do you see the puddle on the floor? Yeah, I can see that. Is your name Cyrus? Yeah. Well, this is what you've got to do next. You what? You've got to return the vessels and send the Jews back. Okay, I will. That's exactly what happened. And no wonder by the time we get to Daniel chapter 6, Daniel is the prince of the Medes and the Persians. He's number 2. He's preferred amongst the presidents. Isn't that wonderful, brothers and sisters? And I believe Isaiah 44 and 45 was there to help Daniel in the court in Daniel chapter 5. Now, when you come back to Daniel chapter 5 here, we left the king, didn't we, looking like jelly. His colour drained from his face. He's relieved himself in fright. And he goes on a little more, doesn't it? You notice there that the king cried aloud in verse 7. You'll notice in your margin, with might. This is a king that's frightened like a young child. He was once bellowing out proudly. He was making these vows to the gods. And now he screams as a little child. Well, let's just pick up in verse 10 now. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. He brings in his wise men. His wise men cannot interpret what's taking place upon the wall. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed, says the queen. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, and found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, the astrologers, Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. Now, this cannot be the queen of the king, because we see in verse 2 that all the wives of Belshazzar were there in the room. This has to be somebody else. I believe that this is the wife of Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the king of Babylon. He was the father of Belshazzar. And we read that he was out in Arabia for 10 years. And that's why I believe Daniel is not there in Daniel chapter 3. Because the real king was out of the city, out of the empire. And there was Daniel performing a duty for the king. That's what I believe anyway. You've asked me where Daniel was in Daniel chapter 3. So this is the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And she too would have remembered all the things of Daniel 1, Daniel 2, Daniel 3. She would have known how Nebuchadnezzar loved this man. That Nebuchadnezzar appointed this man to be the chief of the Magi, the wisest of the wise. And Belshazzar didn't even know who this man was. And can you see that? It's lovely, isn't it? I'm sure you know this. But clearly she is polite as his mother-in-law or his mother. But she says there, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father or thy grandfather, the king, I say, thy father. Can you see that? There's a repeat there. He's your grandfather. He's your grandfather. Remember the great Nebuchadnezzar? Well, he used this man all the time. You fool, she's saying. You have forgotten this great man, Daniel. Well, let's just look at a few phrases here in verse 12. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, she says to Belshazzar, and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, she tells him. Now let Daniel, she doesn't refer to him as Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now, what you need to notice there is that phrase, dissolving of doubts. And as you've got on the screen here, the two Hebrew words make this mean the loosening of knots. So she was saying, this Daniel can solve knotty problems. He can undo knots. In fact, we can see that these two Hebrew words are used 3 times in this chapter. So there's a real play on what's going on here. It's quite amusing, isn't it? So in chapter 5 and verse 6, we have the joints of his loins were loosed. In verse 12, we have the dissolving of doubts. And then verse 16, we have dissolve of doubts. And the word doubts is the same Hebrew word here, or Aramaic word, as joints. So the doubts is the same word as joints. So in other words then, the doubts had caused the loosening of the joints. Can you see that? It was the doubts, brothers and sisters. It was the doubts. And this had made Belshazzar a floppy mess. His joints were all loosed. So the queen tells him, unlike Humpty Dumpty, someone can put you together again. That's exactly what's taking place. He was a complete mess, wasn't he? And he's the only man. He's the only man that can do that. And isn't it astonishing that though, and we know this, you can just flick back to chapter 1 and verse 7, how Nebuchadnezzar gave Daniel that new name, that name of Belteshazzar. And this woman is the daughter of this king that gave Daniel this new name. But she doesn't know him by that name. And perhaps as soon as we come to Daniel chapter 2 and the interpretation of that dream, perhaps it's suggesting here that once that took place, that name never belonged to Daniel. It was always Daniel, brothers and sisters. Well, when you go down to verses 16 and 17, we see here that, well, look at verse 16. I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. So Daniel comes out, he's now speaking to Belshazzar, and we've got this dissolving of doubts, the dissolving of doubts there in verse 12. As we said, this play on words, and he provides this reward. And notice that you can become, he says to Daniel, the third of the kingdom. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Because I've already said Nabonidus was the number 1 there. Number 2 was Belshazzar, and number 3 would be here, Daniel. Now, what's interesting is that this didn't make sense until archaeological evidence. It was the archaeological evidence that told us that Nabonidus was the father of Belshazzar, and he was the king during this time. So many historians and authorities have contended against this chapter because they said, why would Belshazzar say these words? Well, we now know through recent Bible archaeology that he was number 2. Isn't that wonderful? Again, evidence proving the veracity of God's word. Well, Daniel doesn't want it, does he? He says, look, I'll read what's written on the wall, but I don't need any reward from you. My reward's in heaven. Verse 22 then, and thou his son, he says, O Belshazzar, has not humbled thine heart. This is the message. Though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and thou hast brought the vessels, notice, this is the reason. Thou hast brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines, have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold and brass, iron, wood and stone, which see not, nor hear not, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. Can you see what he's saying there? You have brought the vessels of God's house, and you have treated them with contempt. You considered them to be worthless. You consigned God to a cup on your table. There was Yahweh as a cup on his table. Yet we've already read that the whole nation of Babylon was a cup in God's hand. Can you see what he's saying there? And notice that phrase in verse 23, the God in whose hand thy breath is. King Belshazzar, you can't place Yahweh in a cup. In fact, your very breath is in his hand. Can you see that? And look at the hand upon the wall. That's the message, that this is the hand of God, and you, Belshazzar, and your kingdom are in it. The message was from God. It was final and it was unequivocal. Well, let's just look at this interpretation, the mene tekel upharsin here. So verse 24, then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. So it was all about the completion of the writing. And then once the completion had taken place there, then the full sentence was revealed. Verse 25, and this is the writing that was written, mene tekel upharsin, and this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balance and art found wanting. And Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So we just want to briefly just go through these things here. We notice as we look at these words that they are words of value and weights. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Because we've already emphasized that this was all about absolute value. Who had absolute value? And here God is saying, at the end of this kingdom, I am absolute. When you made me worthless, I told you I am absolute. Now, so the first word then is the word numbered. The years were numbered of Belshazzar. Now, I believe that these were numbered to the day. I believe that it was almost to the day, possibly to the day, that the vessels had entered into Babylon 70 years earlier. Look at this, brothers and sisters. Come back with me. Keep a hand in Daniel. Come back with me to Jeremiah chapter 26. This is a slightly different account that we've looked at before. This doesn't relate to the 70 years of Jeremiah chapter 25, but it relates to the king and the period of the kings. And look at these words. Jeremiah chapter 27. And bear in mind, as we read these words, we've said Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, and King Belshazzar. A grandfather, a father, and a son. Look at this. Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 6. And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field have I given him also to serve him. So this whole kingdom had been given by God. But notice these words here. And all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the very time of the land come, and then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. Look how accurate that is, brothers and sisters. All nations shall serve him, Nebuchadnezzar, his son, and his son's son. That's Belshazzar. Belshazzar should have known through the writing of Jeremiah that he was the last one. There was no offspring. It was finishing with him. So here then, it was numbered to the day. Now the word tekel is the word weighed, and it comes from the word shekel. Now the shekel was in the temple. It was the unit of exchange. It was God's weight. And God was saying here, I have weighed up you with my scales, and I have found you wanting, Belshazzar. Now that was obvious, wasn't it? Because all the vessels were strewn all over the table in this drunken stupor. And so God could say that he had weighed them up because they had made his house, as it were, a den of thieves. Can you see that? They had made his house a den of thieves. These were the vessels of God within the banquet hall. And there they were, drunken, drinking from these cups. He weighed up Belshazzar. Now I want to show you 3 ways in which God weighs kings and the people of this earth up. We're going to go through these quickly. Come with me to 1 Samuel chapter 2. I want to show you how God weighs up men and women. How he weighs us up, brothers and sisters. This man's days were numbered. But look at this, 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 3. We're just going to look at isolated verses here to show you how God weighs up individuals. He certainly weighed up this king. 1 Samuel 2 verse 3, talk no more so exceeding proudly. Let not arrogancy come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. So God weighs up your actions, brothers and sisters. He weighs them up. He observes what you do. And he finds us wanting, doesn't he? Come to Proverbs now. He doesn't just weigh up actions. He starts to look at the inner intents of our hearts. Proverbs 16 and verse 2. All the ways of a man are clean in his own eyes, but the Lord weigheth the spirits. So it's not only the actions. Here God weighs up our motives. And then if you finally go to Psalm 62, trying to connect all these thoughts to Belshazzar. Psalm 62 and verse 9, we read there, surely men of low degree are vanity, and men of high degree are a lie, to be laid in the balance. They are altogether lighter than vanity. So here God weighs up pride. So we were right. The book is all about value. It's when the king assigned no value to God and his vessels that God intervened, stepped in, and brought his kingdom to zero. Because this was the night that the curtains were drawn on this empire. God had been patient. There were the vessels in the treasure house for 70 years. He had patient. He'd been patient with the nation and God's people there. But when they degraded these vessels in some drunken party, then there was writing on the wall. And it's the words of the Lord Jesus, isn't it? For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Well, coming back to Daniel chapter 5, there is also another word, isn't there? Upharsin. It's the final word. It's the final word there. We go back to Daniel chapter 5. But you notice something strange there, because in that phrase, mene, tekel, upharsin in verse 25, you see mene in verse 26, tekel in verse 27, but just Perez rather than upharsin in 28. Well, there's a double meaning here, brothers and sisters, and it's rather intriguing because upharsin means divided, and that was the message. His kingdom was going to be divided, but the word Perez is the proper noun for the Persians. So here then the message was that his kingdom would be divided by the Persians. Christians. It was a very explicit message. There was going to be no confusion. It was very clear. It would be divided by the silver. Now, brothers and sisters, we've all heard of the phrase, the writing on the wall. It's when we receive an early message, an early warning. And brothers and sisters, it's lovely, isn't it, to come to Bible schools like this. But if you just think about your own private lives, what writing on the wall is God inscribing in your lives? What is the early warning for you? Are there things going on in your marriage? Families? Ecclesias? Your relationship with God? This is the day, isn't it, that we should take note and we should read those words and take action. It was too late for King Belshazzar. Cyrus was at the door. This lesson comes to us, brothers and sisters. Well, very quickly, look at this. It's just a proposal. That's all it is. Let's just quickly, it's on the screen here, we'll go through this quickly. Let's see whether there's something else in the phrase mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Well, we've already said that the golden shekel here was the unit of exchange. But we also know that the mina here was 50 shekels. So if you convert this phrase into shekels, the unit of currency, let's just see what we get. So the mina is 50 shekels, the upharsin is 25 shekels, and the tekel is 1 shekel. So the phrase then, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, is 126 shekels. Now it's just a suggestion, it's just something to think about. That's all it is. We know that the shekel is divided into 20 gerahs. And you can have a look in Ezekiel 45 verse 12, it tells us that. So when you look at mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, and you convert it into the shekels, you get 126 shekels, but you also get 2,520 gerahs. Where did you see that number? It was the 7 times, wasn't it? It was the times of Nebuchadnezzar as a beast. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Was this another message to tell the kingdoms of the earth how long they would have dominion over the nation of Israel? And in 1917, that image of Nebuchadnezzar began to shake a little because the Jews are streaming back. Just a suggestion, just a thought, brothers and sisters, something to think about for yourselves. Well, have a look at these closing verses now as we bring our thoughts to an end. Daniel chapter 5 then in verse 30. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, I want you to think about this. Nabonidus was taken captive by this time. Belshazzar was slain. And we read there that when Daniel interpreted the dream, he had the golden necklace, right? The golden chain around his neck. So come to Jeremiah chapter 51. This is where we want to finish here. Jeremiah chapter 51. And this chapter we've already looked at is the chapter of the doom of the Babylonians. And look at verse 57. And as Cyrus comes into this room, and as Daniel also enters into the banquet room, we read these words there in Jeremiah 51 and verse 57. I will make drunk her princes, and her wise men, her captains, and her rulers, and her mighty men, and they shall sleep a perpetual sleep, and not wake, saith the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. So I think Cyrus came in and saw all these things, and there was Daniel with the scroll. And there they all were drunk that night, asleep, and the kingdom would come to an end. And as Cyrus entered into the banquet room, who was wearing the royal chain? It was Daniel, brothers and sisters. For just one night, Daniel was the king of Babylon. He ended up as the king. Can you imagine that? brothers and sisters? What a turnaround of events. And then he handed over the scroll to Cyrus and says, God foretold all these things. And no wonder the Medes and Persians appointed Daniel to the top of the kingdom. And I want to finish with these thoughts. The 1,000 lords and princes are drunk. The vessels are strewn all over the table. And all that's left is the flickering candlestick that's lighting up the wall. And it's about to go out. But there's the vessels. And on that night there was a particular radiance and beauty, as if the vessels themselves were rejoicing because they're about to go home. Thank you.